Hello and welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hi, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you so much for coming and for giving us time on your Sunday morning. I would like to welcome everybody and just give a few introductions. I'd like to welcome you to EIHR's webinar, Yazidis in Iraq, Rebuilding and Healing from Genocide. I am Kim Klett, Deputy Executive Director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights. Founded by teachers for teachers, EIHR supports communities recovering from violent conflict. We do this by applying lessons from the Holocaust and other egregious violations of human rights as a starting point for teaching secondary school students about how these conflicts evolve and how to prevent them. In addition to our webinars, we currently have projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, Cambodia, Argentina, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We do hope you will join us for future webinars. On December 14th, we have a discussion with Richard Hiskus on his book, Suffer the Children, a Theoretical Foundation for the Human Rights of the Child. I will put the link for that in the chat box in just a minute, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Now I would like to introduce our presenters for today. Abed Shamdeen is a global development specialist. Abed was born and raised in Sinjar, Iraq. For the past 6 years, he has advocated for victims of the Yazidi genocide and has managed projects that have brought aid and assistance to internally displaced Yazidis in Iraq. Abed worked for the United States Army in Iraq as a cultural advisor and translator. He holds a master's degree in political science from the School of International Service at American University. Abed is a co-founder of Nadia's initiative. Olivia Wells is a human rights advocate with a master's degree in human rights law. Her expertise is in prevention of gender-based violence, international criminal law, and sustainable development, with a regional focus on the Middle East. Over the past 7 years, she has worked with several European and American INGOs, conducting policy research, promoting civic mobilization, developing programs, managing donor relations, and establishing and maintaining partnerships. She has worked on the ground with marginalized communities in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Southern Africa to help implement community-led development. She has also implemented refugee aid programs in Southern Europe and is responsible for developing psychosocial support projects for child refugees in Athens, Greece. At Nadia's initiative, Olivia oversees the organization's robust portfolio of projects in Iraq and manages all relationships with donors and implementing partners. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that if you do have any questions during the program today, please put them in the chat box, and I will read those to Abed and Olivia after they finish presenting. So with no further ado, Olivia and Abed. Oops, you're muted.
Sorry, hi everyone. I just want to get our presentation up. So as Kim mentioned, my name is Olivia Wells. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships at Nadia's Initiative. And here's my colleague Abed, who's our Executive Director, and as Kim mentioned, one of the co-founders. Abed is from Sinjar, Iraq, so he's going to he's a Yazidi. He's going to take you through what happened in 2014, as well as a bit of background about who the Yazidi community is. And then we'll walk through what happened in 2014, where the community is now. And then I'll come in and tell you a little bit about our programming and how Nadia's initiative works to, rebuild the Yazidi community in this post-conflict setting and also prevent future violence. And then we'll talk as well a little bit about the advocacy work we do in tandem with the programming. And of course, talk about how Nadia Murad, our fearless leader, is kind of spearheading the advocacy work. So I will now turn it over to Abed.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Kim, for the introduction. We are happy that you have given your time to learn about this issue on a Sunday and to hear about the challenges the Yazidi community is facing. This is specific to Yazidis, as you will hear, but I can tell you this is probably an example that fits other religious minorities and other groups in the region, whether in Syria or Iraq and other conflict areas, and especially when it comes to women facing challenges in conflict areas and post-conflict areas. So happy to be here with all of you, and thank you for your time again. Quickly talk about why we decided to start Nadia's initiative. I started this work as Kim mentioned and as Olivia mentioned. I was born and raised in Sinjar. It's my homeland. I immigrated, I moved to the US in 2010 because of the work I did with the US military. I got a special visa and moved here in 2010. I got involved in this work in 2014 when ISIS invaded our homeland because my friends were there, my family, my classmates, and my entire community. And we got involved. I got involved with a group of other Yazidis and friends, people that I worked with in the military and beyond, to try and raise awareness. We came to Washington, D.C. to speak with the government and hold rallies to bring this issue to the agenda for the government to help rescue the Yazidis from Mount Sinjar and from those attacks. Coming back to Nadia's initiative, who we are. As a community-led, survivor-led, Nadia founded this organization because, to be honest with you, we were a bit frustrated the way things were going. For years, we advocated that Yazidis need some sustainable solution to be able to recover from this genocide. And till today, as we will get to it in our later slides, the majority, around 60% of the entire Yazidi community in Iraq is displaced inside their own countries in the same tents that were set up back in 2014. And so our focus in terms of programming, it has been Sinjar because of the vast need, that the immediate need on the ground. ISIS reduced many of the villages to rubble, destroyed the network of infrastructure, including wash, livelihood, farms like Nadia's family. If you have got a chance to read Nadia's book, you probably know about that Nadia's family, her mother was a single mother that raised 11 children, making a living off of a farm they had in their village of Kojo. Many Yazidis were like that and lived like that, but unfortunately, when ISIS took over the region, they destroyed the entire system that Yazidis have relied on for generations. And so that's why we are focused in terms of programming on Sinjar, helping restore these services, but also support survivors of sexual violence and empowerment of women. We also do advocacy globally, which we will get to in one of the slides, Olivia. I know we have it in the slide, so I'm not going to go there. We can talk about that later. Who Yazidis are. Yazidis, as an ethno-religious minority, small group, have lived in the region, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, north of Iraq, Kurdistan region for centuries. What we call Sinjar, around Mount Sinjar, as you can see in the slide, is the ancestral homeland of Yazidis, because Yazidis were concentrated around Mount Sinjar after many campaigns of genocide, like what happened in 2014 by the Ottoman Empire and by different groups that try to eliminate Yazidis from the region simply because of their religion, because of their faith. And as you can see, including my family, most of Yazidis in Sinjar were located deep in the mountain or around Mount Sinjar because of fear of persecution. They just used that mountain in the past for cover, for protection. As you know, in the years between 1975 and 60s to until the fall of the Saddam regime, Yazidis slowly started to expand around Mount Sinjar because there were no organized genocides against Yazidis around, at least around that period. There was discrimination and persecution, but not organized genocides. So Yazidis started to expand a little bit outside the foothill of the mountain. But another issue was that in the 1970s, the Ba'ath Party, which is Saddam's political party, forced all of Yazidis, including my family, to relocate to organized communities far from the mountain, because their reasoning was that it's easy to control the population in outside the mountain and to be able to mobilize the population as they wanted, and to make sure that there were no resistance against his regime. And so Yazidis were forced to relocate from their original communities once in the 1970s, and they therefore losing their farms, livelihood, and the system they had in place for generations. Why Yazidis have been targeted again? If it's ISIS or during the Ottoman Empire back then, during the Saddam regime, is because Yazidis are, their religion is different, their culture is different, a small group, and misperceptions and ideas that Yazidis have been, there are rumors always that Yazidis are not clean people. Yazidis are worship a different god, and there were countless rumors and propaganda by different groups that simply didn't want Yazidis to exist in the region. And with the recent attack by ISIS, they used, unfortunately, or they used text in the Islamic holy book against Yazidis. You know, obviously, we know that the text in the book is not, you know, written to use it in that way, but it was used by ISIS, unfortunately, in saying that Yazidis, it's shame for, you know, a Muslim majority region to let people like Yazidis, who are considered not people of the book, to exist within our region. And that's why when ISIS took over the region, for example, you know, they obviously captured regions where Christians live, in Mosul, Nainoa, and other Nainoa Plain and other places, but they gave them options. You pay what is called jizya, a fee tax, and stay here in your homeland, convert to Islam, or leave. And that's, you know, as you might know, most of the Christians chose to leave and went further north, again, also for protection, and left their property and livelihoods behind in Mosul and other places. But Yazidis does not get that choice because, according to ISIS, they were not people of the book, and therefore use that text to say it is okay to enslave Yazidi women. It is okay to force them to convert. It is okay to execute Yazidi men. And so, unfortunately, what happened in 2014, ISIS. Olivia, if you can go back to the map, please. In this region is surrounded by communities that Yazidis lived with them for centuries, like I said. And when ISIS attacked Mosul, they captured Mosul, Anbar, and the region around Sinjar. They left Sinjar to the end because they had a plan, a systematic plan they wanted to commit genocide against Yazidis. It was not by accident. It was this was a plan that ISIS had in mind, and therefore surrounded the whole region, the Sinjar region, from all sides. But you know, they attacked first from the south side, captured most of the villages that were in the south, and that's when the entire Yazidi population was forced to flee to Mount Sinjar to take cover. Unfortunately, people like that lived in villages like Nadia's village, which was much further away from the mountain, were not able to make it because the proximity to the mountain was, and some of them tried, but they were captured on the way to the mountain and brought back to the village and just surrounded them for about 2 weeks, from August 3rd of 2014 until August 15th. The entire village where Nadia is from was under siege. And we tried at the time. I was in Washington, D.C., where I was actually in communication with the villagers at the time. But we were not able to organize any sort of help to try and rescue them. What ISIS did is, those that they captured, they killed Yazidi men. Right now, there are about 86 or 85 mass graves that have been discovered so far in Sinjar, where they have, you know, found remains of Yazidis that were killed by ISIS between August 3rd and August 15th. These are just the ones that have been able to find. Only in Nadia's village, where 1,700 people live, they have discovered so far 17 mass graves. And those are the only ones that have been exhumed so far. The rest of them, 8 years, unfortunately, 8 years after what happened, are still out in the open, unprotected, and the evidence is slowly disappearing, which is another issue we are faced in terms of evidence collection. They also captured more than 6,000 Yazidi women and children, including Nadia, as you know, her sisters-in-law, and her mother. What they did with the women and children, they took all the younger women and collected them in areas and then took them to Mosul, to these headquarters of ISIS, and held them there for a few days. For the older women like Nadia's mother and others, in just one mass grave, we have found remains of 83 women that were considered by ISIS not fit for sexual slavery. Therefore, they didn't have any use for them. They executed. They took the women and children to Mosul. From there, where they distributed the women and children. Yazidi boys were taken into camps in Syria and Iraq and other places where ISIS was holding territory, trained them and brainwashed them. In fact, some of the children were trained and brainwashed to a degree where they used them as suicide bombers against Yazidis in later days in 2017 and 16 and after the capture of Sinjar. The women, all of the women were used to fuel ISIS's war and distributed them to their fighters across Iraq, Syria, and other places, and then used them later in online markets in places like Raqqa, where the capital of ISIS Caliphate was, held auctions to sell these women and children. Till today, we have about 2,800 of those women and children missing. We don't know where they are. We assume they are mostly in Syria, held somewhere. Some of them have been transferred to Turkey and other places. And they have been in this held by ISIS and their supporters for the past 8 years. What happened that also, as I mentioned, the entire Yazidi population was forced to flee their homes. Those that made it to Mount Sinjar were trapped on the mountain for a few days. Some died on the way on the mountain because of thirst and hunger. But it was August, the heat of the summer was like more than 100 degrees in the region. People didn't have water and they were trapped on the mountain. Eventually, we were able to coordinate with the US government and open a safe corridor for people to be able to go to Syria, and then from Syria to north of Iraq, where they are now. And almost all the population that was able to survive, went to the Duhok and Erbil area, where the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And camps were set up by UN agencies and other organizations in the region. Close to 350,000 to 400,000 were displaced. And now, after 2015 and 2016, the area was liberated from ISIS. Until now, as I mentioned earlier, more than 200,000 Yazidis are still displaced, about 60% of the population. And we have not been able to help those return home because one, lack of services, security. There is a conflict between both the governments in Iraq, Erbil and Baghdad, over control of the region, which is a problem, and that creates a barrier for people to return home, basic services, and just fear. People that fear that if these mass graves have not been exhumed, if people that joined ISIS from communities around us and helped ISIS capture Yazidis have not been held accountable, how can they go back home? And this is why we have focused on one hand trying to provide the services that we can, basic services, restore them at least, and rebuild farms and other things that Olivia will get to in a moment. But on the other hand, also advocate for justice and bringing ISIS to hold them accountable for the crimes they committed against Yazidis, and other pieces around that, the missing Yazidi women and children, trying to coordinate some effort to find them. One thing before I hand it over to Olivia to talk about these other pieces is that for you as educators, you know better that, I grew up in Sinjar. I grew up there. I finished high school there, and then I joined, with the U.S. military in Iraq to work with them for 5 years before I moved here. In my years of high school and primary school, well, now I know there was never any mention of Yazidis as a part, a people that existed in that region in Iraq. Nothing about our history, nothing about us as humans, and citizens of Iraq. And in the texts, and especially the history we studied, it was mostly about religious wars and and other things that happened in the region, and the history of the majority of Iraq, not these smaller communities. And I think this is one of the issues that we face till today, is that people have not been educated about the existence of these smaller communities like Yazidis, and unfortunately there are rumors and there's hatred that compiled for years, and then when ISIS attacked in 2014, as I mentioned, communities around Sinjar joined them because of these misconceptions, because of demonizing Yazidis as a community that is different, that is unfit to exist in this region. And that, unfortunately, that type of rhetoric helped and encouraged many people to join ISIS and help them capture Yazidis and Yazidi women. So this is another issue we are facing. And so, Olivia, I'll hand it over to you, and happy if I missed any of these pieces, I'm happy to come back to it and answer questions.
Thanks, Abid. Thank you so much. I think it's really it's really important to hear about these things from a member of the community, and that's something that I'm going to be kind of circling back on quite a bit in terms of how our organization operates. We're unique in the sense that we're survivor-led and we're community-led, and that's something that I'd like to see more often in both the humanitarian aid sector and the development sector. It's really, really critical that organizations that are that people that are directly impacted by this are leading the organizations that are doing the reconstruction work. And that's what we have at Nadia's initiative. And I think that puts us in a really unique setting to do critical work on the ground. We have Nadia Murad, who's both a Yazidi activist, but also a survivor of sexual violence, who is our president and founder. And Abid is our executive director. And as you well know, he's also from the community. And so we were founded in 2018. We didn't really start our programming fully until 2019. But as Abid mentioned earlier, and I'd like to come back on to this, it's our mandate that we only work in Sinjar. And this is a mandate that Nadia herself made very early on. And the mandate comes from her and Abid recognizing that so much money was being poured into the IDP camps and the Kurdistan region. And while we're by no means saying that kind of humanitarian aid is not necessary, it's a very reactive approach to redevelopment rather than a proactive, long-term sustainable approach. And what's disconcerting about this is these camps, as you all well know, they're meant to be short-term camps to house these people until they can either return to their homeland or immigrate elsewhere, where they'll be able to rebuild their lives. And unfortunately, we see this with IDP camps and refugee camps all across the globe, that people end up living in these camps for decades. And life in these camps it's absolutely horrific. I mean, people do not, you're living in close quarters, thinking about that with the COVID pandemic, you don't have access to proper job opportunities. You don't have access to proper education for your children, proper healthcare. Living in these camps, it's just, you don't see a future when you live in these camps. And We've seen many cases where fires have broken out in the camps, and Yazidis that have been displaced for years, then lose their lives to fires in the camps. There's been incidences of sexual violence in the camps. There's been high incidents of suicide rates relating to, PTSD and trauma from not only surviving genocide, but then having to live in a situation where you don't see a future for yourself. So what we're doing is we're trying very hard to, and we have been for the past several years, to shift focus from the reactive short-term solution of the camps to the proactive long-term solution of rebuilding the homeland to facilitate a dignified return and enable this community to move past survival mode to thriving. We don't want them to survive, we want them to thrive, and we empower them to do so by focusing on rebuilding their homeland. So this is the part 2 of the work we do, and that's our programming. And I'll sort of break that down shortly after this. And part 1, repairing the past, is very much tied to our advocacy work, which goes across many different sectors. Abid touched upon a few, but legal and justice for survivors. It goes to security, local governance, women's rights, reparations for survivors of sexual violence. I will get into that a bit later, and Abid will also build on that. So we're doing these. It's very important to say that we do the advocacy work and the programming in tandem, because we really can't do one without doing the other. So in terms of our programming work, this is just a very snapshot overview of what we've been able to do in the past 2.5 years. We're quite a small team. We have about 8 full-time staff on the ground in Sinjar. We have an office in Sinjar, and then we have about 6 or so HQ staff. So we're not a big organization by any means, but we're able, because we're community-led and because all our team on the ground in Sinjar are from the communities that we're working with, that we're working to benefit, we're able to have an innate knowledge of community needs. I'm going to keep harping on this. It's so important that our team is made up of the communities that we're serving, because it means that we're very well trusted in the work that we do. We have an entire wing of our programming that's focused on community outreach. And it's important for us that the communities we're serving are a part of the program development and implementation process. That means we go out into these communities, we talk to them, we see what kind of support they received, we figure out where the gaps are, we hear from them about what projects they'd like us to do. And from there, we develop the projects together with our program staff in Iraq and our HQ staff in Europe and the US. And then we advocate for funding for these projects. And when we're successful, we then implement either directly with local CSOs, local NGOs. That's obviously our preference, because then the benefit of this programming is twofold. We're both benefiting the community, but we're also empowering these local groups by building their capacity to do these types of projects. Sometimes if we have larger multi-sectoral projects, we'll work with more other international NGOs that have a footprint in Sinjar and are trusted among the community. That's really critical for us. And in the case of our very large scale projects, we also collaborate with larger entities like various UN organizations that are operating in northern Iraq, as well as USAID. So this is a snapshot of the different sectors that we're working in. We focus on education, women's empowerment, healthcare, cultural preservation, livelihoods, and WASH, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene. And I'll walk you through these a bit. So women's empowerment, as you can imagine, is really critical. As Abid mentioned, women were targeted, Yazidi women were intentionally targeted by ISIS and used as weapons of war. And we've seen this in genocides throughout history, right? Women are intentionally targeted through sexual violence, through rape. It's this idea that, you you use women to tear apart communities from within, and that's very much what happened in the case of the Yazidis. So you can see some statistics here about what Yazidi women and girls who survived captivity and survived the genocide are dealing with, in fears of stigmatization, shame, a lot of trauma. So what we're doing at Nadia's initiative is that we noticed very quickly that there were a couple of things. One, there was an innate distrust of Yazidi women and girls of most international organizations. That being primarily due to the fact that many international organizations had basically come into Sinjar and ask them all these questions, force them to kind of relive their trauma and share their stories with the promise of support. And many times that support doesn't come to fruition. So of course, these women are frustrated and they feel like they've been abandoned. The other thing that we noticed is that which is a problem, is that many organizations, in terms of specifically women's support, all they were giving these women were trainings and psychosocial support. Yes, mental health care support is critical, but it cannot be provided on its own. Women need mental health care support in tandem with livelihood support, clean water, shelter support, healthcare, medical healthcare. So we realized very early on that there was a lack of a holistic approach to empowering these women and helping them rebuild their lives. So all this to say that what we're trying to do is take a holistic approach. And what that means is that we have various types of programs for women in general, and then also specifically survivors of sexual violence. These programs include rebuilding women's houses, providing them with basic household materials. We did the first ever women's small business project in Sinjar, where we not only selected the women, provided them with training, helped them develop business plans, but then we actually take the next step to help them set up the business and sustain it for the long term. That's really key here. And these women have come to us and said, this project has been incredible because I now feel like I own something, that they have their agency restored, they're empowered, and it's a form of mental health care because they can focus on this. They have something to look forward to every day, and they can feed their families and they can put food on the table. So again, a holistic approach. And of course, we have a protection team, so mental health care support is built into all our programming, but it's really important that we're providing, Abed and I use the term soft support when we're talking about vocational training and mental health support. What we're trying to do is blend that with hard support, which is tangible support, which is setting up these livelihood programs, restoring shelter, providing women with clean water, helping them get back into school. So our programming for women's empowerment goes across all of the other sectors we work in, but is specifically targeted to women's needs. Also, right now, we're about to launch the first ever interim reparations project for survivors in Iraq. And this is a unique project that will provide survivors with reparations in the interim, because reparations are state responsibility. And I'll come to what that looks like in Iraq in a bit. But that's not happening yet. So what we're doing is trying to step in and provide support until that happens. And that support will be very tailored, very individualized, and spanning across all these different sectors I've mentioned. So this is a bit about our women's empowerment work. Healthcare. Healthcare is incredibly important here. And especially in light of COVID-19, as you can imagine. And healthcare was one of the sectors that was unsurprisingly targeted by ISIS. Hospitals were targeted, primary health centers were just absolutely flattened and destroyed. And to be frank, the healthcare sector was not robust to begin with in Sinjar. And this has a lot to do with what Abed was touching upon, which is this history of marginalization of this community. They've been marginalized through, resource deprivation in addition to actual violence against them. And so resource deprivation means Yazidis in Sinjar have not had access to the same care as those living in Dahuk or Erbil or other regions of just even northern Iraq, still northern Iraq, but they just don't have the same access to quality care. So what we're trying to do at Nadia's initiative is we are rebuilding or building brand new primary health centers. We also furnish equipped with medical equipment and supplies, and then work with the local authorities to staff and reopen these primary health centers. We've done a lot of projects in the existing general hospitals, one in the north, Sununi General Hospital, one in the south, Sinjar General Hospital. And what that looks like, for example, in Sinjar General Hospital in the south, we built a maternity ward and we built a surgical ward. We've provided the hospital with several rounds of medical equipment and supplies. And we're also working on training the existing staff. Our flagship project in the sector is Nadia's flagship project, which is the construction of the first ever comprehensive medical facility in Sinjar. We're working on this project with the French government. It's going to take quite a few years. So in the interim, we're trying to make sure that we build up the sector, the existing centers, and get these primary health centers that were destroyed by ISIS opened again. Education, again, like healthcare, ISIS targeted schools, destroyed, flattened them. And you have the situation where children who have returned to Sinjar have been out of school because of this. And those who have been stuck in the camps have also been out of school. So you have an entire generation of Yazidi youth that have been out of school for over 7 years now. And so what we're trying to do here is similar, where we rebuild or construct brand new primary, middle, and secondary schools. We furnish them, and then we work with the local authorities to staff and reopen them to get these kids back into schools. We're also working on a project that will potentially bring the first post-secondary education center to potentially a university in Sinjar. And again, this is, resource deprivation. Yazidis have never had a higher education institute in Sinjar. They've always had to travel great distances. And for Yazidis that are from more rural areas and living in poverty, that's an expense that they can endure. So again, like I said earlier, we don't want them to just survive. We want them to thrive. We want to move them past survival mode. And so that's why we're focusing on these different sectors and these kind of projects that provide really tangible, direct support to students and women and youth and the entire community. So agriculture, well, and livelihoods just in general, but very much focused on agriculture. So the Yazidi community has historically been an agriculture community based on where they've lived historically. And I think about pre-ISIS, about 75% of the livelihoods income for the community was focused on agriculture. ISIS knew this, and ISIS intentionally destroyed their farmlands, burned them, thus destroying their livelihoods. And the intention behind this was to prevent the community from ever returning and ever rebuilding and ever thriving. So what we're doing to reverse that is we're rehabilitating farmlands, everything from reconstructing irrigation systems, re-drilling wells, getting equipment to these farm owners, getting greenhouses, providing them with dairy cows, trainings in sustainable agricultural practices. We've done quite a few farming projects, I think, to date. We've targeted over 500 farmers in North and South Sinjar. One of those projects was targeting about 350 female-headed farming households, restoring their farmlands and enabling these women, who most of whom lost their husbands to ISIS, and they've now become the breadwinners, enabling them to assume those roles and put food on the table for them and their families. So we focus on that, but we also we label it under this category because it is connected to livelihoods. We focus a lot on infrastructure, basic infrastructure restoration, rebuilding the electrical systems in Sinjar, because that's connected to the WASH infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals. So it's really important to get the electricity back up and running, rebuilding the main roads, which will then improve commerce and trade. So we focus a lot on infrastructure as well, and helping, stepping in where there's not yet the local, authorities are not yet ready to step in. Although the idea is that in the long term, the local governments should be doing this. And again, we're a small organization, so we can't do this all on our own, but we recognize the imperative of doing this sooner than later, because people want to leave the camps and they want to return home. So we need to do this work. This is one of our female farmers. Cultural restoration, this is an important one. You can see some statistics on the Yazidi religious sites that were targeted by ISIS. We've done to date 3 temple projects where we've rebuilt Yazidi temples that were destroyed by ISIS. In addition to temples, we work as well on memorialization initiatives, which is really important for the community. And we're looking to the future, we'll be focusing more and more on that because it's going to play a role in reconciliation. And of course, clean water. Arguably one of the basic building blocks to just a standard quality of life. ISIS targeted wash infrastructure, damaged pipelines, polluted wells. So we're working again to reverse that. It's really expensive for Yazidis that have damaged wells. They end up having to either travel long distances to get water or to purchase bottled water, which is just not sustainable. So we have, for example, a project right now that's focused on restoring clean water in 22 villages across North and South Sinjar, which will inevitably provide almost 80,000 residents with clean water. And you can see one of our beneficiaries here. So I'm gonna have Abed jump back in here a bit, but just to sort of set the stage, as we've both mentioned, we do a lot of advocacy work in tandem with the programming work. And the advocacy work as well spans across different sectors. A massive focus is, of course, justice, which is tied to the exhumation of mass graves and bringing ISIS perpetrator to court. And Abed will speak a little bit more to that. And we're also focused as well on justice for survivors in the form of reparations. Earlier this year, the federal Iraqi government passed the Yazidi Survivors Law, which is an incredibly important law and is going to be instrumental to getting women the government reparations that they should have gotten years ago. We're working on that. It's an uphill battle. We're working very hard right now with the government and other organizations to make sure the implementation of this reparations bill is survivor-centric. So that's also a portion of our work. And then, of course, there's the global advocacy work around gender equality and supporting survivors of sexual violence and preventing sexual violence and conflict, which Nadia spearheads and has been doing for many, many years. So Abed, on that note, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Olivia. Thank you. Yeah, so our advocacy, just going back a little bit for a minute, as I mentioned, I worked for the US military for 5 years, but obviously I was not the only one. Thousands of Yazidis did because, you know, the US military was able to trust Yazidis that worked with them, including myself. We worked as translators, as cultural advisors, and I know Nadia's older brother, who was a mechanic, worked for the US military in one of the bases as a mechanic, who was, killed by ISIS in the village. Many Yazidis who survived this genocide that worked with US military were left behind, to be honest with you, when the US left. I think, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the rise of radical groups and also led to significant rise of violence against Yazidis. Between 2003 and 2014, when ISIS took over, there were many attacks against Yazidis in the south side of Sinjar. They used semi-trucks loaded with explosives and took them to these rural villages south of Sinjar and exploded them in the middle of the village. They were asking people to come and told them that they were distributing aid, and people gathered, and these trucks went off, killing hundreds of people and reduced these mud houses to rubble. This is the advocacy we're doing. Basically, in these years is trying to say, look, this is a situation the international community, the US and others who were involved in this war in Iraq for many years, kind of created for, at least for us, for a small minority like us who is defenseless. We don't have the resources like these other groups, like the Kurds or the Arabs, or to have our own protection. And it's the same for the Christian community in Iraq. We can protect ourselves. And that's why ISIS, we have been easy targets for these groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others. And, we're saying that you should help because of these reasons. And we're saying that there's overwhelming evidence that this was a genocide, organized campaign of sexual violence against women and children. There is public evidence, there is legal evidence that has been collected, testimonies of survivors that have provided them to the UN team that Nadia helped create by advocating at the UN to pass a resolution to create UNITAD, which is responsible mainly for exhuming mass graves and collecting all the evidence and testimonies. And now they are sitting on thousands and thousands of documents and recordings and that can be used in a court of law, but unfortunately there is no court of law that can be used because nobody's asking for it. And so the advocacy is largely around a few areas where, one, political support and political pressure on the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government to making sure that they resolve their disputes of control around Sinjar so that people are able to go back home and stabilize the security situation, to more support in terms of development to try and help people go back to their original communities. And most importantly, advocating with these UN agencies, which we haven't really gotten anywhere in international community, to locate and rescue those that have been missing for the past 8 years, which, as I mentioned, 2,800 women and children. And finally, justice in terms of using this evidence, holding ISIS perpetrators accountable. There weren't only Iraqis. There were US nationals, European nationals, Arab nationals that were part of this genocidal campaign against Yazidis in 2014. And I can tell you that these trials that have been happening are vague, general charges of terrorism against some of these, participation of in a terrorist group or some sort of vague charge. There are no mentions of genocide against Yazidis. There are no mentions of sexual violence against Yazidi women. And so this is what we continue and will continue to campaign for and advocate for with UN agencies, with international community. In fact, next week, we have an extensive schedule of advocating with the new administration in Washington, trying to get them involved, which they haven't really been involved so far, unfortunately. And so I think, Olivia, if you have anything else, and we can take questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free to send your questions, to ask the questions.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing we could touch upon quick. I see there's one question in the Q&A, but it's actually something Abed and I were talking about with Kim prior to everyone joining is, and I think this is really something important to highlight that's happening right now as we speak. So, again, Abed and I both put a lot of emphasis on the camps and the life in the camps and the fact that it's unsustainable. But Abed's also touched upon all these other issues, that there's still security issues in the region. There's not enough investment. It's hard to get people to return. We by no means, it is never our intention to force people to return, just to create an environment that would enable them to safely return and then thrive. And we're a small organization. It's hard to do this on our own. And there's not enough focus on the work that we're doing still to this day. And so what's happening is that, of course, many Yazidis are they feel absolutely helpless and stuck in these camps, and they see that nothing's happening, that the federal government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government aren't keeping their promises to help rebuild Sinjar and improve the security situation. They feel helpless. They have family members that are, have already immigrated to various parts of Europe and other countries. And so what we've had an issue recently where, and I'm happy to answer more detailed questions, but just for the sake of time, for those who don't know, there has been for the past year tensions between Belarus and the EU. And what happened is Belarus, in a sort of, you could argue, an act of a kind of Cold War against the EU, basically opened up a travel pathway between Iraq and Minsk, between Baghdad and Minsk and Erbil and Minsk. And there were travel agencies in Iraq encouraging Yazidis and other groups to go to, if you fly to Minsk, you'll be able to go to Europe. And so all of a sudden this summer, we saw this influx of many, many Iraqis, a lot of whom were Yazidis, taking these flights from Erbil, from Baghdad to Minsk, where they receive a Belarusian visa, so they're allowed to be there. And these tour guides in Belarus would bring them to the border and point and say, if you walk across, that's Germany, or if you walk across, that's France, wherever they were hoping to get to. And of course, that was not the case. It was the border with Lithuania, Latvia, Poland. And what happened is, of course, they met the border guards in these various countries, and they were not allowed to cross. But what then happened is that they turned around to go back into Belarus, to go home, and they were not allowed to go back into Belarus either. So this is an ongoing situation that, shockingly, hardly anyone is talking about, but there are dozens, if not more, and Abid is in contact with these individuals on a daily basis. And we've been working since August with the governments of these three countries I've mentioned and the UN agencies to do something about these Yazidi men, women, and children, among other groups, that are now stuck on the border between Belarus and these three countries. Neither side's letting them in. They're starving. They're being abused on a daily basis, and it's about to become. I mean, it already is, but this is a incredibly. It's a humanitarian crisis that no one's talking about, and so I think it's good to at least use this space to kind of get this issue on everyone's radar. It's something that is very much on our radar, and we've been working on. And it's a case where, unfortunately, you can't work with Belarus because they're an authoritarian government, and the EU is not assuming their responsibility to protect. And so everyone's kind of throwing their hands up saying, oh, we can't do anything about it. And yet people are at risk of dying. So this again ties back into this issue of these people being stuck in these camps, being unable to return home, and this narrative that Abid and I often come back to, which is the genocide against the community is ongoing. Genocide is not a singular event, it's ongoing, and the community is still displaced, still in captivity, still not receiving the support and services they need to build back their lives.
Thank you both. I just wanted to mention a couple of things and then ask one last question. A lot of our participants are teachers we've worked with around the world who have experienced similar things like what you were mentioning with the IDP and refugee camps, the patterns that we see with genocides. And so I just wanted to mention that I think it's very relatable to a lot of our listeners today as well, and focus or brings back that focus of what EIHR does with the teacher to teacher framing. One of the questions, speaking of teachers, that I've seen several times in the chat box now is asking, what can teachers do in their classrooms to support your work? What can we do? Obviously, teaching about what's happened with the Yazidis is important in bringing that awareness, but are there any other actions we can take in our classrooms to help Nadia's initiative?
Abid, you want to answer that?
Go ahead, please.
Well, I think Kim has a really great booklet that we've shared with her, which can be hopefully will be shared with, I think she will, with all of you. And that's a great starting point. And I think, you know, I can tell you, I went to public school in New York City, and we spent in a lot of time on the Holocaust, which made sense, but we spent hardly any time on discussing any of the other genocides that have happened all over the world. And when you take that approach, you're failing to draw these connections to underlying themes that are connected to why genocides happen in the first place, what are tactics of genocide, how can we prevent genocide. And so I think, you know, talking about the Yazidis in this holistic context of talking about not just the Yazidis, but the Holocaust, but the Rwandan genocide, but the Yugoslavian, war, and all these instances in particular, where, like the Yazidis, women were used and targeted, intentionally targeted. I mean, again, this is even relevant in terms of the genocide against Indigenous Americans in Northern America, where you had the rape of Indigenous women to tear apart the community from within. And I think, where we again, we're small. I see some of the comments, because we're so small, we're not able to, do as much advocacy work at a localized level as we'd like to, hopefully in the future, in terms of, going to high schools and sharing this. Abed and I do quite a lot of events like this, but we're quite stretched because, as we mentioned, there's a lot of needs and a lot of different points we're touching upon. But I think we're happy on our end, by the way, to share, in addition to the booklet that we will share, any other information that you need. There's a lot of information on our website with a lot of statistics that will be useful. We're actually, and I think this could also be helpful, in the next couple of months, we'll be releasing our second Status of Sinjar report, which will be a really quite hefty document, kind of outlining all these points that we've discussed. And that's something that we will be publicly releasing and will be available to everyone as well. So that's another sort of vehicle for information sharing. But I think at a higher level, just weaving in the Yazidi story while discussing genocide in general and and drawing these connections to these other genocides is really important, because it raises awareness among students about what creates the conditions for genocide to take place, and which enables people to think proactively about how to prevent future genocides.
Exactly, and that is how EIHR got started, is looking at the Holocaust to begin, and then looking at these other genocides, using that as kind of a framework. So thank you for mentioning that. Olivia, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would say, maybe I should be doing better and decide. I usually leave it to people to decide what they, can do and what they are interested in doing. I think, like Olivia mentioned, it starts with just awareness, raising awareness, and knowing about. I wish this was in person so I can ask how many of you knew about who Yazidis are, and then how many knew how many Yazidis are missing, who knew how many, the current challenges Yazidis are facing. Just reading, if you're, if you can share a book among yourselves, maybe about, Nadia's story, which talks about the way of life for the community before ISIS, and the conditions that they left a security vacuum and created the situation and enabled ISIS to take over. So I think it's mostly just awareness, and sharing this information with your network, and just directing people to follow these different pages, and read up on the work we're doing. And but most importantly, I think, is talking to some of the folks in Washington who tend to forget that they cause some of these issues, and they put these people that are defenseless in these situations, and they tend to move on and get to the next topic and just leave communities behind and not talk about them. It was Congress who authorized the war on Iraq. It was was the government that left the security vacuum and enabled the Iraqi elites who are corrupt and are part of this issue of the tragedy of the Yazidi community. So again, just reminding them that some of them, including our president now, voted on this, and they should not forget about the situation they put people in.
Kim, I just wanted to draw attention to an interesting question in the Q&A that I think Abed is very well equipped to answer, which is what should be the responsibility of the international community to once and for all allow Yazidis to have their independent land? Abed, given that you work really closely on that.
Yeah, sure, happy to do that. I see someone commented that they've tried to find information on Google and YouTube. Unfortunately, yes, this is another issue, is that there are forces that do not want us, the community to get on the right track. I know we're running out of time, but keeping 300 and 200,000 people in these camps for 8 years benefits a group of strong men in that region where they have access to resources and contracts for providing services, though temporary, to these camps, and having easy control over all of that resources, millions of dollars that go in there. And so I think it will be really difficult to find accurate information on what's going on and the needs and the proper way to deal with the situation. That's why it's very important, to do this kind of stuff with people, and we try to do as much as we can and encourage people to read the book. If you can't get a copy, I'm happy to send you one. If you share your address or something, I'll be happy to send you a free copy to just read about the situation. In terms of the land issue and independence, we are a very small group, and as Olivia mentioned, and I remember this, we have been resource deprived for generations. Just trying to survive in the region because of discrimination and persecution, but also in that remote region, in the years that there were US sanctions on Iraq, Yazidis and communities like ours were hit by that economic hardship more than anyone. And I grew up during that time. I was a child. I grew up during that time. I remember it. We were literally resource deprived. We barely were able. The Yazidis were barely able to survive. And so the idea of economic or the independence, having our own region, is because we're a very small community. Geographically, it's very difficult also because we are surrounded by communities that do not wish for us to be able to have our own region controlled by our community. And so, and as I mentioned, one of the main issues is that we're on, in this region where both different groups in the region are competing and over control of that area because it's connected to Syria, Iraq, and the region, and it's sort of a strategic connection between these different groups.
Well, thank you both for being here. I'd like to thank all of our participants. This has been wonderful. It's been enlightening. It's been an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I love seeing in the comments all of the people who are maybe weren't that aware of it before and now are and are making some commitments to make this a part of their teaching. So thank you very much for helping us with that. As I mentioned in the chat box, we will be having a discussion on December 5th to discuss the book. This is what it looks like. It's an excellent book and will give you a lot more information. And we hope that you can join us for that. We also will be sending a follow-up email that will have the link for that as a reminder, but also will have the resource that Olivia mentioned that's great for classroom use. You can print it or use it online. It's an excellent resource. So thank you again to both of you. We so appreciate your time, and thank you to all participants. And we'll see you in a
Yes.
couple months.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
taking the
everyone.
time to listen and to watch. Have a good
Thank you.
day.
Thank you. You all too.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.